We are going to talk now about politicized racial identity development, which was a model that was introduced by William Cross, originally published in 1971, and there's lots more that has been published since then. I'm giving you the original reference here. Bill Cross is an African-American psychologist, and he was interested in understanding how, during the Black Power movement, a previously denigrated identity, a Negro identity, was revalued through the Black Power movement to become a positively valued Black identity. So the idea of Black is beautiful. He was trying to understand how was it that a group of people were able to take this identity that had been disparaged in society, had been treated in a negative way, how were they able to reclaim it and make it a positive identity? So Cross's model goes through 5 stages that talk about how an individual can develop a positive and politicized racial identity. And in a minute, I'll talk also about how this is a model that has caught fire in psychology and has been used by many other researchers to describe the politicization of other types of identity. And I'm specifically going to talk about feminist identity development in a minute, because that's one of the theories that many of the students use to understand your activism. Okay, so the first stage that Cross talks about is called pre-encounter. And the pre-encounter stage is basically the stage, if you're just born into the world and you haven't been taught any sort of critical analysis, you're in the pre-encounter stage. So it's the stage that most little kids are in, where they don't really think about what their race in this particular case means, or any of their identities mean in society. They just kind of hear what society tells them about those identities and just kind of take it without question. Post-civil rights movement, there's a question about whether African-American kids are actually go through this stage. Some scholars have argued that the family socialize kids early on so that they don't ever have this kind of pre-encounter identity. So the pre-encounter identity is seen as kind of an unenlightened identity. It's the one where you just kind of, you take the stereotypes at face value and you don't question them. The first stage that Cross identifies along the way of developing a politicized and a critical racial identity is called encounter. Encounter is a stage. It could be you might have a positive experience or a series of experiences, but more likely it's a series of negative experiences with discrimination, racism, something like that. It's a stage where the wool is pulled from your eyes and you suddenly start questioning what society has been teaching you about your group all along. So it could be an instance of racism or sexism or something like that, where you suddenly say, wait a second, I'm being treated unfairly because of my group membership, because of who I am as a person, not who I am as part of this group, and not because of something I did. The encounter stage typically involves a fair amount of anger. There's sometimes a sense that you've been duped into believing what society has taught you all along. So that's the first step along the way of politicizing the racial identity. The next stage is called immersion, and then it's got the second phase of it, immersion. And immersion is a stage that people go into in large part to deal with the anger that has developed in the encounter stage. So in the immersion stage is where people surround themselves with positive role models, with ways of being whatever that positive identity is. So in the racial identity development model, it would be surrounding yourselves with positive and valued Black role models. So it might be that you refined Black literature, Black art, Black music. You may find ways to link into African culture or something like that. And the idea about immersion is that you are trying to be the best type of whatever that identity is. So for racial identity, you're trying to be the right kind of Black person. Or for feminist identity, you're trying to be the best type of feminist. So one little side effect of this particular stage is there's often a lot of black and white thinking that goes along with it. Because you're throwing out the old identity and you're developing a new identity. It's really hard to do that gracefully. And one of the things that happens is that sometimes people are judging other members of the group and saying that they're not X enough. So you can't be a feminist if you shave your legs, or if your skin is not dark enough, you can't be black. So it's that sort of very black and white and rigid thinking. The immersion part of this is recognizing that after you've been in this stage for a little while, you might be ready to kind of emerge into a more integrated world, that you may not need to surround yourself with people that are just like you and think exactly the same way, that you might be able to integrate back into a more diverse world. And that leads to the next stage that Cross talks about, which is internalization. So internalization is the stage where you may start to take people as more than just representatives of their group. You may see them as individuals. You may recognize that not all black people are correct and right all the time, and not all white people are wrong or incorrect all the time, or not all men, in the feminist case, not all men are oppressors or chauvinistic. Not all women are positive feminist role models all the time. So it's this idea that you think about individuals as individuals and as members of their group, but you don't just take them as members of their group. And then the last stage that Cross talks about is internalization commitment. And that is the idea that you've internalized all these critiques of how your group has been treated in society. You're able to take people as individuals, and then you commit yourself to fixing what has been happening to your group in society for a while. So you're committed to fixing the world. And more recent theories have talked about how this internalization commitment stage can accompany any of the second, third, or fourth stages. So people often become very politically active when they hit the encounter stage. It's another way to deal with those new feelings that you're trying to deal with. Two other things I want to say about this. One is that, as I said, this was originally introduced in 1971, but there's been a lot of work on this model since then. One of the things that happened is Thomas Parham, who's another African-American psychologist, introduced the idea of recycling. And that's the idea that you don't just go through these stages once and then you live happily ever after in the internalization commitment stage. You may, as a young adult, say, go through these stages and then be in the internalization commitment stage for a while. And then when you have children, you may encounter all over again the first time your child experiences discrimination. So you may recycle through these particular stages a second time or multiple times. So that's one. And then the other thing I wanted to say about it was that these models have been critiqued for being stages. And most theorists nowadays think of these as things that can occur at the same time. So people can be in the encounter and the immersion stage at the same time, or it may be, be between stages or things like that. And in social movements, you certainly have people in all different stages at different times. Okay, and there was one other thing I wanted to say about it, which is that some people have argued that this model here devalues what you might say people in the immersion stage are. So you might argue that separatists or people who are more militant, you could probably argue that a lot of them are in the immersion stage. And because we've got a 5-stage model, you might say, oh, they're arrested or they're stagnating or something like that. And I'm not passing any judgment on this at all. I think social movements need to have people, all different types of people, to make them successful. But this is something just to keep in mind, that there really isn't a value judgment placed on this. It's just really, in my opinion, it describes people in different expressions of their politicized identity. And it generally shows the trajectory that people go through. And the other model I just wanted to briefly mention, I've already pretty much described it when I described the politicized racial identity development. I often used examples for feminist identity development. But there is a feminist identity development theory that was developed after Cross's, by Downing and Roosh in 1985 that was based on Cross's model. And it has 5 analogous stages, and I'm just going to tell you what they are. Passive acceptance of traditional gender roles. So this would be people who agree with statements like, I like being a traditional female, or I think men are better at math and science than women are. Then we have revelation. That's analogous to the encounter stage. That's the idea that the wool, again, is pulled from your eyes and you see, oh boy, the society's really more sexist than I thought it was. Embeddedness emanation is analogous to the immersion stage. So this is the idea of finding ways to revalue a feminist identity or a female identity, really. And then synthesis is that stage that's analogous to internalization. So the idea that you will take individuals as individuals and not just representatives of their group. And then active commitment is analogous to the internalization commitment stage. So the feminist identity development model is one that a lot of students used to understand your activism, and along with the politicized racial identity development model as well.